Hello, it's my turn to welcome you all here in Athens. As also the first Greek. Thanks for all for coming here, and hopefully you'll find my speech interesting. Thank you also for the introduction. And before I put you through 1 hour of economics presentation, I'd like to give you some motivation, although as I understand you're quite a sophisticated crowd, so probably you're not be needing it. I will start from the very general aspects of economics, let's say GDP, productivity, etc., which one, let's say, could find a bit boring, but I'll try to narrow it down to things that you guys care about, which mainly is metal prices. Now, I don't know much about steel, but in the course of my works during the years, I've been looking at copper as a leading indicator of economic activity, and after that, I've started looking at copper mainly as an asset class per share. So I'll try, so I won't talk about steel, but I'll try to focus a bit about metals in general. So in very general terms, you see there is, although if you just see a graph of long-term nominal GDP in the US and the price, this is the Goldman Sachs Industrial Metal Spot Index, there you don't see much by looking at it, but there is a correlation. If you look at the monthly, quarterly returns and growth rates, there is a positive overall correlation between the two, and it's natural because when GDP is high, growth high, you have a high demand, and then prices go up. And if you look at other indicators, the correlations are much higher. Now, what's more interesting is the correlation of metal prices with the US dollar, as of course you all know, but it's quite high. Right now it's around 75%. And it's not only because metal prices are quoted in dollars and their relative price goes down as the price of the dollar goes up, but also the US dollar is the world's funding currency. And when the dollar is cheap, then this is GDP growth boosting, and then that's another aspect, another reason why demand is higher when the dollar is down. So right now I'm going to talk about, my presentation is separated in 3 units. One is about structural forces in the economy, the other one is cyclical, and then I'll talk about some market implications. When we say structural forces, we mean forces that we don't really see day to day, but they're there and they're exerting their influence in markets and economies slowly but surely. For example, let's say your productivity is weak in the US, or the US is consuming a lot, has a huge current account deficit. And we believe that right now these forces, the structural forces, are really more important than usual in the US economy and the global economy. I'm going to focus more on the US economy, then a bit on China, and then in the structural section, just a bit about the Eurozone, and then on the cyclical part, equally about the US, Eurozone, and China. So we believe that we still live under the influences of the 2007-2009 global crisis and recession. And we can see that because central banks feel obliged to heavily intervene in markets and economies by providing excess liquidity. This is a graph of the of the portfolios of the 3 main central banks as a percent of GDP. And you see it's around 93% of GDP in Japan, it's around 38% in the Eurozone, and around 25% in the US. And right now we're at the juncture where central banks are contemplating of removing or dwindling down or their influence, their liquidity intervention. Now, the question is, are we out of the woods yet? Are we okay to go back to where we were before 2007? And we feel that actually there are still some really long-term problems with the global economy, and we think that central banks should be very, very careful in retracting their liquidity provisions. And we tried so high. Of course, this has major implications about growth and about the dollar and about interest rates. Okay. And if you look at the US GDP growth starting from 1950 up to 2009, the average growth rate, real growth rate, was 3.4%. Now, after the crisis, starting actually, and if we don't take into account the really deep recession that was around 4% of GDP on a year-on-year basis, the last 7 years, the average growth rate was around 2.2%. So the upper limit of GDP growth, let's say we're in a range of 2.5 to 1.9% in GDP growth. So something has happened to the US growth rate. And it seems as if there is like a permanent shock, as we say, in GDP growth, a downward shock. It's for somehow, right now, maybe we'll come back in 2 years and then this has corrected itself, but we haven't seen a period before where this, with such a persistent deceleration of US growth. And why is that? One of the reasons is because productivity, the amount that each worker produces in the US has also declined a lot, from 2.3% to 1% after the crisis. Actual productivity has started to decline after around 2003. There are some spikes that has to do with higher unemployment because this is output per worker. So when unemployment is high, you have fewer workers, which seem to be more productive. But if you take out this effect, you have a steadily declining productivity after 2003. And there are many reasons why this might be the case. And some say that, for example, the recent productivity gains that we see in Facebook or in the internet economy are not as important as the internal combustion engine, electricity, or the internet per se. The other reason is that in the internet economy, the firms have not been able to capture all the benefits and the incomes that are associated with it, so maybe there are some measurement problems. What other reason might be, and even if there is some mismeasurement, the problem is that productivity gains, either there are no productivity gains or productivity gains are not translated to higher wages which are required for higher inflation, and then you have to have higher interest rates and for the US a stronger dollar. So productivity is, you might think it's quite an abstract notion, but it's very much linked right now to the problem that Fed cannot really increase, doesn't feel that it has to actually increase the interest rates a lot, and also because GDP is lower than one would expect, and that's why also the Fed should be very, very careful in taking out its monetary stimulus. Now, remember I said after 2003, productivity has started to go down, and because that's exactly the time where, remember Greenspan with a measured pace of increased interest rates, and interest rates really remained quite low, and the conundrum why longer interest rates were also low. There was a huge leverage in the US economy that the US households leveraged up to 100% of their disposable income, and that was part of the problem that led to the 2007 crisis, but also it did boost GDP growth. So as productivity was going down, you had leverage going up in the US, and that boosted growth. Now we have quite a deleveraging, around 20% of GDP. Still, though, the households are leveraged, 80%, around 80%, it's still quite high. So that means when you have leverage, you can't have too high interest rates. That's another reason why the central bank should be cautious. And the problem is, as you had the household deleveraging, you had government borrowing. Okay, so as households were cutting down on their debts, in order to prop growth and the economy, the US federal government increased their debt over GDP to around 28%. So you've been hearing about deleveraging, but globally and in the US, there's no deleveraging. Its leverage is more or less the same, but it has transferred from the US, from the private sector to the government, to the official sector. And parallel to that, you had this, the brownish line is the federal balance as a percent of GDP in the US. So it's the QE effect, where the Fed increased their balance of their holdings from 5% of GDP to 25%. So you have, in order to boost the economy and support the economy, you have a parallel increase in debt and in money printing in order to give liquidity. Another problem is that this printing, all this extra money is propping the economy, but it's not an engine of growth. The money, there's kind of a liquidity trap, as we say in the US, where the money is sitting in the banks' vaults and in the coffers of companies. The companies are not using their cash to invest in their own processes in the production of new products because of all the reasons we said before, low productivity, deleveraging. They don't see where the future demand is going to come from. They're worried that if they invest too much in new products and new technologies, there won't be any buyers because everyone is still leveraged. So, for example, you see in the left graph is what we call velocity of money in the US, which says how many times money in the US is churned around in order to create all the transactions needed, and it has fallen from around 2 to 1.6 after the crisis, which means that the extra money that goes in the economy is not really flowing as it used to. And on the right-hand side is the free cash flow per share of the US firms. So it has increased to almost 120 around to 120 cents per share, and this has happened in parallel with this decrease in velocity of money. This is the brownish line is the blue on the left inverted. So what we're saying here is that we have too much money, but this money is not working as it used to, and because we don't see where future demand is coming from, and companies are not investing. If companies don't invest, this is bad for productivity because in capital goods you have embedded new productivities, new technologies. This is not creating wages, and wages are not creating inflation. And also growth is not created real either. Real growth is not created either. So that's another structural problem that the US faces, and it's bringing down GDP growth. And on top of that, we still, US, with all these problems, quote unquote, the US is still the world's consumer of last resort. This is the trade balance of the GDP as a percentage, the trade balance of the US as a percentage of GDP. It's around 4%. It used to be 6%, but still the US is the major consumer of the US, of the world. We live in a world of peak globalization. You see before, this graph goes all the way up to the early 900s, where you had high tariffs, you had Bretton Woods Agreement. After Bretton Woods Agreement collapsed, you have a period of globalization where the US started consuming the world's commodity products. So now we have a US consumer that is not as strong as before, but still is one of the main forces of aggregate demand globally. Of course, with all this, you've been hearing that with all this populism, that's another big worry. You have this globalization, and there's a fear that you have a mini reversion of this trend, so meaning that everybody seems to be more introvert, and that's another major global concern, which of course we're not going to talk about everything right now. So, but right now the basic conclusion is that there seems to be this slowing down of the economy, in the US economy, and the Fed and the other central banks cannot be very aggressive in reducing liquidity. So that means that we are more likely to remain in a low inflation, low yields, and not so strong or weak US dollar, which to the extent that there's enough growth out there, this is quite good for commodities and metals. Now, what could change that? That's the big question. What we need is three possible candidates. Okay, we have like a productivity enhancing infrastructure spending. That's so if the governments actually start spending in their respective countries, and which increase productivity, this creates jobs, and this creates more investment, then you have like a spark that would actually change all that. Also, if you have new technologies, so that not only if they increase supply, but they have to increase demand, so they have the final consumer being stronger. And also, global growth, it has to increase. So China, of course, is a big candidate. But before go there, remember infrastructure spending. That's the catchphrase of the Trump election promises. And actually, it was a very good idea. And actually, markets thought it was a very good idea. So that's, if you have a glimpse of how a whiff of structural change would be, that's how it would look like. This is how markets reacted after the election victory of Donald Trump, where you had the S&P equities, you had, which is the orange line, I think. It's the green line is metals and also going up, but also parallel to that, you had yields going up and US dollar going up. That was a very rare thing that for us that we look at the markets on a daily basis. I hadn't seen that since the 90s, to be honest with you, and I was very excited that something is really changing. And actually, that's what markets discounted for 3 months, that actually something would change, that would create aggregate demand, would create inflation, but would create growth, more growth than inflation. The Fed would have to increase rates, but that was okay. The dollar would go up, but that was okay. I mean, metals didn't go down as US dollar and yields went up. But after markets realized that it would be very hard for the Trump administration to pass their reforms and their packages, then there was disappointment. The disappointment happened in the US dollar and the interest rates. So you had the decline in yields, decline in US dollar. Now, commodities and stock market didn't flinch. Actually, equities kept going up. There were some volatility, some slowing down in the price of metals, but again, because of the weak dollar, the price went up. So the bottom line is, if you have a credible, really strong package of global growth, an aggregate that really is good for aggregate demand and sends the dollar up, it's not bad if it's really that strong and it's increasing productivity and it's if investors believe that they're going to increase growth. But so right now we go back to the previous regime, the liquidity regime, the regime that we need central banks, and that's what the graph says, that although we don't have these expectations about the stimulus from the Trump administration, we're okay as long as the dollar is weak and as long as yields don't go up too much. So a small summary about the fiscal package. We don't have much information about that since spring. Everything's put on hold. The idea is, in order for this package to be, fiscal package to be credible, it has to, for a 1% increase in spending, you have to have at least 1% increase in GDP at some point in the future. If not, that means you need more funding, you need leverage, you need borrowing. So, and if you need borrowing, that means that your debt is not sustainable. That's not a very popular word in Greece, but it can happen to anybody. And also, you have to have a big deficit as a percentage of GDP. So for the Trump administration to actually implement their project, if ever it goes through Congress, you have to have a 2.6% deficit as a percent of GDP, and also you have with these numbers around 50% increase of debt to GDP in the next 20 years. So it would be good to have a fiscal package, but it has to have a higher multiplier than the 0.7 than the Congressional Budget Office is forecasting. So as I said, besides the US, another natural candidate for global growth pickup is China. Of course, people like you that deal with commodities, of course, very well know that. China is in a natural slowdown phase, okay? Natural means that it has grown so big that it cannot keep on growing by 11%. That's the average from 1992 to 2009. This average has decreased to around 8% after the crisis, and right now it's growing even slower, around 6.5%, which is the target of the Chinese Communist Party. They themselves have said that they would like to have, we're okay with a slowdown as long as we can change the mix of our economy from consumption to investment, which is very important. We're going to talk about it a bit more. But right now it seems there are some indications that actually we might see an acceleration of growth in China. There are some leading indicators where we see some acceleration of growth in China. This is more on the cyclical part, which means it's good right now for the global economy, but there are still many problems that will have to be addressed on the structural part that we're talking about right now. Of course, China, even with 6.5%, still is the #1 contributor of GDP growth, expected GDP growth for the period 2017-2019. Around 30% of GDP growth is expected to come from China, and around 17% from the US, while the US, in nominal terms, is still #1 as a percentage of growth of overall of GDP level. Okay. Of course, if you look at the other measurements, using purchasing power parity, where you take more bigger weights to weaker sectors, then China comes first again. But that's maybe an exaggeration. But the point is that even in a weak state of slowing down stage of Chinese growth, you still have China contributing the most in global economy. But still, China has problems. It's still over-leveraged. Okay, China is overall debt to GDP is around 250%. Most of it comes from corporate borrowing, sorry, and it's linked to many investments to the investment part of the economy. There are many investments that are actually yielding too low in the US, so in the China. So the problem with the Chinese problem is how to deal with this over-leverage. And of course, the Chinese problems are not of the same quality, let's say, that the ones the US had when they're facing their own private leverage story, because most of this leverage is internal, and also the Chinese have a huge amount of reserves that are able to use them to manage this deleveraging. And also, the nature of the economy, which is a hybrid between market and centrally planned economy, helps them at this stage to actually deal with this problem. But still, there are forces, as we'll see, of deleveraging there as well, which have some negative correlation with growth. Now, where things can go good for the global economy and what should happen, and I've been to presentations even around early 2000s, saying that you have to have the switch from demand from the US to China. You see, Chinese are consuming around 40% of GDP, while the US are around 70%. And on the other hand, the Chinese are investing 46% of GDP, and the US only around 7%. So you need to have the next consumer, the marginal consumer, as we say, should come from China. There, the returns should be higher. Then there should be investments also from the US mainly. And when I said the US, I also I'm referring to the developed world, but I'm using the US as a benchmark. So this would increase investments in places where investment is low, would increase productivity, would increase wages where investment is low, and also you'll have more consumers coming to the market, and then firms would feel more comfortable investing their cash to new products and technologies. Of course, this is a very hard exercise, also for political reasons, and also it's not easy to shift even a centrally planned economy overnight, and it takes it's a very slow-moving process, and there are two ways that this can happen. There's a good scenario where everything happens in the context of a global economy where firms are like a textbook. Firms allocate their capital to where they see the maximum returns, and they go and find what the Chinese consumer needs, and then they make investments, et cetera, et cetera. That would be very good. You have higher growth, higher inflation, and then also you need a very substantial depreciation of the US dollar, which because you need to have the US consumer being weaker, less purchasing power, and the Chinese consumer stronger, more purchasing power. So but still that's the good scenario. Now the bad scenario is you have a trade war, everybody is locking himself up. Everybody tries to cater their own audience, their own consumers. So that initially could be good for the US economy, meaning that you have firms that are geared towards bigger audience, higher consumption. So, but after that, you have a very high inflation, where everything is more expensive in the US. So you'd have a period of hyperinflation, then you have maybe stagflation. Whereas for China, it would be really negative. It would cause recession. So you have a period of turmoil, but suddenly, after this turmoil and maybe big recession, suddenly, slowly, you'd have this shift. So it's very hard, and I'm not trying to predict how this will happen, but I'm just saying, if we look at signs that this is happening, meaning you have Chinese consumption going up, that would be very, very positive for these structural problems that I'm referring to. And of course, there are politics. Okay, you have Chinese politics that market reforms at the increase in per capita GDP requires, usually have a rising middle class that usually calls for democracy. And also there's a problem of the US response to the rising Chinese power in the Pacific, and you have the geopolitical dimension of the whole thing with North Korea, et cetera. So you see everything, either we want it or not, they're more or less linked together. The Chinese currency is very critical to what's happening here. As I said, a stronger renminbi makes the consumer in China stronger, and which is good. Also, it's facilitating US-Chinese trade talks, because remember Trump has been saying that the renminbi is undervalued. So if it's stronger, then that's a -1 argument. So it's expected to make things more smooth. And it was a very wise thing of the Chinese authorities that in the beginning of 2016 changed the reference basket of the renminbi from the 100% US dollar to around 26%, 22% right now. And because of that, they don't need to defend their currency, and that's increasing you have an increase again of their reserves. And the Chinese reserves are a bit like it's a bit like QE, because when they're buying assets from the developed world, they're giving cash, so they're increasing liquidity. So it's a very good for markets. And so I focused on the structural issues of China and the US. I'm going to talk just a bit, there's only one slide up to Eurozone, because the big problem with Eurozone is that, you all know that, it's a bunch of countries, which of these countries is EMU. You have too much information, you have a dissonance of voices, you don't have a unified fiscal policy, you don't have unified taxes. So what happened in 2012 is that the market started to forecast the dissolution of Eurozone. And Draghi came in and said he'd do whatever it takes, and that's QE, and now QE is ending. So the problem is, what's the next step? What we don't need is if probability of the Eurozone breakup is higher, that's a stronger dollar, but for wrong reasons. So again, it's very negative for everything, starting from growth, equities, commodities. So you need to have real evidence that the Eurozone is going towards stronger, deeper unification, which is actually very hard. You see, even today, after the German election, the politics now are very much against that. I would expect to see the euro-dollar today falling at least one big figure. The fact that it's not, it's quite good, but in the next months, actually, as the German government is very hard, it will be proven very hard to have a government, a coalition government. Probably volatility should increase the next months in the euro-dollar spectrum. But that's the problem with Eurozone. That's how it enters this global equation, that if you don't have integration, you have unwanted US dollar strength apart from everything else that what this means. And so the key conclusion is that, and actually I've been repeating this stuff maybe too much, but you have this over leverage, which when you have too much leverage, it means you don't have, when you borrow today, you are taking from future demand. So that's the main problem at this point. Also, we don't know where the future demands can come from, and that as long as productivity is not here, that's a big problem. Leverage is a problem when you don't have productivity. Income inequality also is a problem because usually very high incomes do not consume that much. They invest a lot and they have too much cash, too much liquidity. So you need to have the middle class being strong again to be able to consume. And that's also a big problem, and also linked to the rise in populism and all the problems that we're reading in newspapers. Politics, and the bottom line is that we still need excess liquidity. So all this set of variables, this set of factors, makes us to believe that we remain in a low growth, low inflation, low yields, weak US dollar. If we had global rebalancing towards the Asian consumer, some productivity increasing fiscal stimulus, or new technologies that ultimately increase demand, then you have high growth, high inflation, and the direction of the US dollar would depend on where this stimulus came from. If it's US, it would be good for the US dollar. If it's China, it would be negative. So these are the main conclusions about the more abstract things you don't think about every day, about the structural issues, which are going to very much affect also the cyclical picture and also our views on some of the markets we're going to talk about. Now, after this kind of gray picture of the US that I painted, the cyclical picture is quite good. Okay, US is in an accelerating phase of growth. Now, this srillogram there, it's part of a statistical estimation filter that we use in order to be able to define what's the actual stage of a US leading indicator that tells us something about growth. So there are 4 quadrants, and there's an expansion, which means growth is higher than the average and it's going up. The slowdown, growth is lower than the average, higher than the average going down. Recession, which you know what it means, lower than average going down, and recovery, higher than the average, lower than the average going up. So right now we're in deep, very intense expansion phase, growth phase, which means leading indicators point to very high growth in the US. Right now the US growth rate is around 2.1%. Actually, we expect that the growth rate at the end of 2017 is going to be on average in 2017 around 1.7%, sorry, to 2.1%. We expect an acceleration towards 2.5% next year. All leading indicators are showing this, but the problem is these leading indicators are partially elevated because of Trump's promises. There was a huge wave of optimism back then. And after that, because of the lower yields and the lower US dollar, pretty much like equity markets. So, and also leading indicators are really leading at the bottom of the cycle and in the middle. At the peak of the cycle, sometimes they tend to be a bit more optimistic. So this, for example, is the consumer confidence indication of the Conference bond in the US, and we have grafted against the real personal consumption expenditures and the real disposable income. And you see that really at the bottoms, you see confidence going up first. In the middle of the cycle, you see confidence leading, and if you have a slowing down in consumption or in income, usually it's income and consumption that go to the confidence level. But at the peaks, sometimes you have confidence being too confident. So that's why you can see that about in other leading indicators. So that's why we think that there is some strength in predicting that the US is going to go around 2.5% next period, but the risks are next year, sorry, 2018. but the risks are a bit tilted on the downside. Now about inflation. Inflation is, even for the structural world that we believe it's a low inflation world, it's still too low. Usually we try to explain inflation with the velocity of money, with all the actual stuff that I showed you before. Productivity, high productivity, because it translates to higher wages, has, after 1993, resulted in higher wages, in higher inflation. Higher oil prices, producer prices, and that are linked to oil prices lead to higher inflation, and higher money growth also leads to higher inflation. Even accounting for these factors that we say they are weak, and we expect them to be weak, personal consumption, core inflation, that if we exclude food and energy, at around 1.4 is too low. So in the next months, we expect an acceleration of this inflation to around 1.8, 1.7%, which again could be linked to a period of relative dollar strength for the next 2 or 3 months, because as markets are too sanguine about the Fed and inflation. But up to there, we don't, remember that 2% is Fed's target, and we don't see the US inflation going towards 2% before 2000. I know it's a very long-term forecast, but 2020, but as far as I can tell, it's very hard for the inflation to go above 1.8, which means, again, you don't have, Fed cannot afford to be too aggressive. US dollar is not going to go back to an upward trending regime. So these are the expectations. Last week, markets were expecting, the beginning of last week, markets were expecting only one hike until the end of 2018. Now it's around 50 to 60% chance that there's going to be a hike in December. And then there's around, again, 40% chance that it's going to be another hike at the end of 2018. Now, we think that what the Fed needs is they're really anxious to normalize interest rates, meaning that the interest rates are low, but they want to, according to the cyclical factors, we believe that they should be low. They're justifiably low because of structural factors, but we think that the Fed is looking more at cyclical factors right now. So they want to take them they want to take interest rate a bit higher, also mainly because to have ammunition in the case that we see a deceleration or, let's say, a recession 2 or 3 years from now. So as long as global growth is strong and Fed hikes do not cause excessive US dollar strength, we think that the Fed will be inclined to make increases in interest rates, very specific and very, very cautiously. So that's why we think that we're going to see one interest rate increase in December, and 1 or 2 increases, a bit more, one more than the market thinks, in 2018, but up to there. You see, this is the blue line is what markets think about interest rates, which is around 1.8 for end of 2018, and the dots are where the Fed officials expect the interest rate to be. The excuse me, the square one were focused in January of 2017, and the other one, the grayer one, the square one was in June 2017, and the gray one is in September 2017. So more recently, the Fed has downgraded mainly their longer-term forecasts, but still they are much higher than what the market expects. It's very interesting that the last 3 years, markets were much more cautious about interest rates than the Fed. And usually we say we don't fight the Fed, but for the last 3 years, it has paid off not believing the Fed and not fighting the Fed, and fighting the Fed actually, because slowly we see that the Fed is going towards the market's views and not the other way around. And that's, we think, even it can be for political reasons, that the Fed is downplaying the structural problems of the US economy. They're not advertising them. And they have the tendency to say that we're going to go back to long-term averages of interest rates, which are around 3%. Well, the markets feel that this is not feasible, and that's why they have consistently the last 3 years much lower expectations about rates than the Fed. And again, I should ask that as a question to see if you're paying attention. If you have structural changes, again, probably the Fed will be right, and then the interest rates will be able to go back to their long-term averages. But this, right now, as we said, this is not the case right now. Now, what's interesting is Eurozone. Eurozone is enjoying a period of very, very robust growth. Nobody, remember last year, we were about to believe that the Eurozone is going to fall apart. Everybody was feeling scary about the election cycle in Netherlands and in France with Le Pen. And nobody was paying attention that we're actually growing. There were some growing tendencies. There was actually growth occurring in Eurozone. And now that the last election cycle up to a point, because I have to say yesterday's picture changed a bit the path and the whole picture, so we have to be a bit cautious. But up to, let's say, on Saturday, you have markets who will start focusing again on growth, and actually Eurozone is coming out of a double-dip recession in 2009 and 2011 and 12, and also of a period of a great political uncertainty. So that means that they're more on the beginning of the cycle than the US, and also this growth comes from domestic demand, consumption, and investment, which means that they're not prone to increase. It's not very sensitive to a strong euro, so they don't care. That's why you see Draghi in his comments usually does downplay euro strength, because growth doesn't come from exports at this point. It comes from internal demand. So we expect around 2% growth for Eurozone in 2018, unless we have a real increase in political uncertainty, which we have to see how this, because this could affect investments and investment confidence and consumer confidence. So we have to see how the German negotiations develop. But right now we have a quite positive view on Eurozone as well. Leading indicators, we use leading indicators as well to see how Eurozone is expected to perform, and saying that we're at the beginning of the cycle more, and we expect, again, they're a bit elevated, so the problem that we said before maybe still holds, but at this stage, because of what I said before, coming out of a double-dip recession, et cetera, there's more impetus in the economy, and maybe they have a bit more leading qualities now in the Eurozone than in the US. Inflation is a big problem. It's in the Eurozone, meaning that that's the main reason that Draghi embarked in the QE to the first place. But the problem is that the inflation has a very big correlation with the price of oil. So there's an absurd element in Eurozone's QE with printing more money, trying to stop oil from falling, but that's another issue. There are other reasons for Draghi wanting to embark in QE. So there's not enough lending in the apart from the price of oil. Lending is a big the change of M3 from M1. If you look at differences in money supply, which is a proxy for lending, lending is weak, wages are also weak, and the price of oil is more or less range trading. So there could be some near-term negative effects in inflation, and we see it converging around 1.5 towards 3 years from now, which is enough for the ECB maintaining, gives enough reasons, excuse to Draghi to continue its QE program all throughout 2018, but at a much slower pace, we think. And according to markets, there's a 50-50 chance that it's going to be one hike, ECB hike in 2018. At the end, we don't think they're going to do something. Now, a bit about China. As I said, Chinese growth goes around 6.5%, but lately there are some leading indicators that point to higher growth. You have increase in railway freight volumes. you have increasing electricity production, you have a higher money supply growth in M1, that's money that's actually circulating in the economy. And they have some other leading indicators that are point to the, let's say, the next 6 months to a higher growth rate than 6.5% in China. I don't claim to be a Chinese expert. We're not able from here to study it in the same way that we can study the US and the Eurozone economy. The data are not so good and they don't go that much. So these are forecasts that have a degree of less confidence than the other ones. But it seems that we're standing in front of a possible acceleration of Chinese growth for the next 3 to 6 months. The one negative factor is, as we said, credit creation. So here is, for example, the change in money supply in M1, which has mainly cash in circulation and very short-term deposits. But if you look longer-term measures, this is the red line. If you look longer-term measures of credit creations, which includes loans and deposits, which is the blue line, the azure, the light blue line, this point downwards, and the blue, the dark blue line is the GDP growth. So that says that we are in a period of acceleration if we take into account the other factors that we talked about, leading indicators. But we have to be very aware of the deleveraging in China, which, as we said, is not going to cause a crash like in the US, probably, like it did in the US 2007, but it could be bite off gradually GDP growth slow and be a decelerating force for China. So what we feel about our cyclical views for the next year, we see that global growth is accelerating. The US is accelerating, but it's bounded, as we say, acceleration. We don't think it's going to go more than 2.5% because of the structural issues, and the risks are a bit to the downside. In the Eurozone, we expect 2%, and mainly there are these political reasons, worries, but the momentum right now is quite strong. And also we expect China to accelerate as well. If we take this, coupled with the structural issues that we talked about, which we think are not going to, and which because of these, we don't expect Fed hikes, 1 or 2 Fed hikes, or even 3 Fed hikes up to the end of 2018, they're okay for this environment. While the US, the global economy is growing with more confidence than the US, we can continue to be in an environment with high growth, low inflation, and a weak dollar, which I think is a very good combination for equity markets, emerging market equities, and also for commodities, which you guys are here that for. So I'll try not to bundle all the things we talked about before with some 4 graphs about some basic markets. If you take the 10-year US Treasury yield from the 60s up to today, all these years, around 52 years, you can explain this movement with 3 things: the money velocity, the real GDP growth, and core inflation. This pink bars is the strength of the explanatory power of these 3 factors. And these are all the 3 factors we talked about. We have low inflation, we have growth that is not so strong, and we have falling velocity of money. Money is not circulating. So if you try to estimate a fair number about the US yields, that's around 2%. So that says that as long as structural changes, which we don't see them coming, and as long as we stay in the old liquidity world that we need central banks, the average 10-year yield about US rates is going to be around 2%, which means that around 2.5, it's 2.7 is a ceiling, which is also good news for commodities, because commodities also have a negative, as I'll show you later, metals actually, not commodities, a very strong negative correlation with long-term US yields. The other problem is the US dollar. The US dollar we try to also model the US dollar with similar arguments that we talked about in the beginning, which has a very positive correlation with real yields, with productivity. It has a negative correlation with GDP growth, which means that you have to have productivity and yields higher than growth for the dollar to go up. So you have a high growth, but productivity is low, and yields are low. That means that you have growth because you consume more and you import a lot. So again, we are in a low productivity, low yield environment, which usually caters to a weaker dollar. Right now, actually, you see the blue line is the dollar index, and the brownish line is what we call the estimated value. And all this increase after 2014 was an overshoot, as we said. So now we're converging towards a more fair value of the US dollar, which we expect it to continue, given the things as things stand right now, of course. And I've tried to, for the purpose of this conference, to try to put everything we said into, try to see if we can say something about the metal index. This is the Goldman Sachs spot metal index, and try to find a fair value, an estimated value, with using arguments that I spoke before, which is I use the US 30-year yields, the US dollar. There is an index of US manufacturers that are geared towards exporting. There's a Chinese leading indicator, and these four are the main factors that are behind the movements in spot prices in metals. You see the two major ones are a very strong relationship with the US dollar, negative one, and the very strong with the 30-year yield. And also some less positive with growth indicators. Right now, it seems, and I'm talking about just looking at the fact that I understand, and I'm not talking about supply and demand and production and inventory issues that you guys know much more about. It seems that the metals have exaggerated a bit this cycle, and these improvements in growth and the weak dollar and the low yields. One can take estimates from 5 to, let's say, 20%. This is around, here the one I've used and looks better, is around 8% overvalued versus this cyclical and interest rate and yield environment. So, but that's another way to try to map the economic and the liquidity cycle to actual dollar price for some metals. Of course, other metals, I've seen the steel price, I saw it has a bit exaggerated a bit more. Other metals like the nickel is really lagging, for reasons that everybody in this audience knows better than I do. Another positive, interesting thing about metals is that they have a very strong movement with emerging market equities. Going back to the 90s, emerging market equities is the red line, and the blue line is, again, the Goldman Sachs spot index, metal spot index, and they have more or less a stable relationship. And now this relationship, within this framework, metals are lagging emerging market equities, and emerging market equities have a very strong momentum right now, which we expect to continue. So by association, that means that after some maybe volatility at this stage, but one would expect that although metals are becoming a bit more expensive, industrial metals I mean, the trend could continue a bit more. As dollar is weak, yields are not high. And I want to say something about steel, so I just graphed the steel price. This is I think it's average China hot steel. I'm not sure, to be honest. There are many prices that you guys follow, versus the Goldman Sachs index that I've used in all the expectations, in all these calculations. So very high correlation. There are periods where one is leading the other, but one can use other metals because, as I saw, there's not much history of steel prices like you find in other metals. So maybe one can use movements of steel prices with other metals to try to say something about steel. Of course, all the time take into account what you guys know about supply and demand and inventory. And that's it. This is the team that looks about in global economics. And the disclaimer, forget about what I said. And thank you. If you have any questions, we can, after, we can talk about it.
Can we have some questions?
Sure, yeah, of course, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Are there any questions for Mr. Patikis from the floor? Sorry.
You had some great charts there. It seems a lot of what you were saying is all based on a weak U.S. dollar.
Mm-hmm.
How do you correlate a weak U.S. dollar when, A, you have the offshore yuan still pegged to the dollar, one, and you have positive interest rates in the U.S. and possibly going higher, besides the fact that the U.S. dollar is a reserve currency? But a lot of the thesis is all based on a weak U.S. dollar. What happens if the U.S. dollar gets stronger?
Well, that's the main point of this. Okay, that's the graph, actually. Very interesting. I will go back. That I skipped. If the US dollar becomes stronger than the world can handle, that's what happened in the end of 2015. The Fed was saying 4 hikes. Everybody believed it. There was a run on the one, remember, and that caused huge volatility in equity markets because the Fed wanted to normalize, but everybody else was still in the middle of QE, and they had weak growth. Everybody was more bearish about Chinese growth and for European growth. So the fact that the Fed said that I want to normalize rates caused a huge rally in the dollar, which actually brought increased volatility everywhere and brought the equity markets down. Now, after that happened, remember, the Fed changed their rhetoric. They included global factors and stability of global markets, not US markets, as a factor because they realized that the effort to normalize the dollar in a weak global environment, forgetting the US structural issues, would be very negative because dollar is the funding currency. And that's why the Chinese were very clever after seeing that to recalculate the reference basket from 100% US dollar. Now I think it's 22. It became 22 in 2015, and I think now it's 26%.
But it's still centrally controlled.
Yes, but the US dollar is only 26% of the basket, and that's why now that the US dollar is falling and euro is going up and other currencies are going up, the renminbi is strengthening against the dollar, which is very good because this will make the Chinese consumer set more the purchasing power globally. Yes, great, the internal. And also it facilitates trade talks. And also the last but not least is because it has been in the Chinese authorities' goals to make this shift from production to consumption. They don't want a very weak renminbi, although it's good for them. They themselves are in a kind of dead-end kind of situation, as much as can say it from here, meaning that they do, right now, exports are fueling their economy, so they want a weak renminbi. But on the other hand, they want to shift the economy from consumption, so from production to consumption, which a weak renminbi is against this goal. So as the US dollar was really, really strong, they tried to hinder this strength, and they were depleting their reserves. And by doing that, this is like negative QE. So markets freaked out, and that's why.
One last thing.
Sure.
Do you believe that the last 10 years of quantitative easing has proven that the quantity of money theory is dead as far as velocity, right?
Well, yeah.
There's no inflation. 20 trillion
Yes, well, I don't have to say. The numbers show that you have, money is not caused because of velocity. People are hoarding money. That's like a liquidity trap. So that's a big problem.
How does that change?
Well, with structural, we have to have a different. Right now, the world is geared towards liquidity. It has been since after the internet bubble. Okay, when productivity fell. So you have to go back to more traditional stuff. You have to go back to not to manufacturing, but you have to have the technology that creates demand and creates wages So that's the answer. And it's very hard to do that because right now the internet economy is not creating incomes because part of the jobs that we paid someone to do it, we do it themselves. We do it ourselves. That's one thing. The other thing is, as it happens with any technological change, usually capital and labor are complements, meaning that a guy with, let's say, a very old computer is less productive than the guy with a really supercomputer. So that means that if you get more productive, your wage is higher. So that's what's been happening so far. But now you have new technologies taking the jobs of really qualified guys, people, maybe like me. Maybe all this will be automatic at some point. So usually it takes time. It takes maybe one generation until you find you have new jobs that use new technology as complements. But now new technology is like substitutes. So a new computer now is like another Patikis. So I'm out of the job. So usually that takes time to do that. So we're in the middle of this process right now. Some say that the 1929 crisis was because of this transition from an agricultural economy to the manufacturing economy in the US. And the turmoil that was caused has to do with that, more of that, and less it was not just a speculative bubble. And it took from 21 up to World War II, sorry. It took almost 20 years for the global economy to come out of this problem with a war.
My question is centered around the Chinese economy. And since China is a consumer and producer of about 50% of the world's steel, it's very pertinent for us. What we've seen is that you talked about restructuring of the economy in China, but the reality is the current political leadership has shown absolutely no moves in that direction whatsoever. In fact, they've shown moves in the opposite direction, increasing state support of state-owned industries, increasing leverage, continuing in the old model, and in fact, leverage is still increasing, and it's still growing much faster than GDP is. The BIS and a lot of other organizations have already stated that China needs to do something, but yet they show no sign of this. And for steel, for us as producers of steel, there are really two options. One is that the Chinese do restructure, in which case steel consumption, because it is a great component of fixed asset investment, will come down, and therefore there will be pressure on prices. Or China at some time hits some kind of event which causes them to restructure in a bad way, which would again hit steel prices and commodity prices very badly. So do you have any comments on that?
Well, the comment is that the positive news were about the cyclical phase that I said. There are some evidence that the next 3 to 6 months you can see some pickup, which is good for you guys. Now, the long-term picture, yeah, it's very hard. I said I don't know how this will happen. There's the good way or the bad way. Now, if it doesn't happen, as long as it's being postponed, then it means that we remain in a weak dollar, low interest rate, global, kind of okay global growth, etc., which again it's good for steel. The problem is that if it happens the bad way, which is the closing, let's say, everybody becomes more introvert, and you have the Chinese trading with themselves, and then that would be very recessionary, which again would be very negative for steel prices. So, there are three things. Okay, cyclically, it looks good for steel or metals the next 6 months. The old regime, where nothing happens and you have support from central banks, again, as far as there is enough growth in China, again, is very good for steel prices. But the third regime is this dead end. It's of course very, very negative. It's very hard from here to say when it will happen, but when it will happen, it will be very negative because you need. Also, I have to say that's I haven't maybe thought enough about it. The old regime in China, where investment is very important, I think you just said it. It's better for steel prices than it is if Chinese goes towards consumption. So that's my feeling about it. So this transition, probably, even if it's good for the global economy, the transition phase probably is going to be very negative for metals, because you have to have like a shift of demand for steel away from China somewhere else. Now, I don't know if there's going to be other Asian countries that are going to take the baton, or maybe developed countries, when they start producing more, make more investments. For example, if you have infrastructure spending, a credible plan of infrastructure spending in the US, parallel to this shift from consumption, from investment to consumption in China, that would be ideal for you. Although you'll have higher US dollar. So you have higher demand, but also higher dollar if the Trump administration delivers, which at least looking at the reaction of markets, price went up. You have dollar going up and metal price going up. So it seems that you guys would be okay if, as China rebalances, something else happens in parallel, which could be the Trump story. If not, then demand should go first down before we have a global growth pickup, and then you have a pickup as well. But that's somewhere in the future. It's very hard to pin down where and how. I don't know if I answered.
I think it's a little difficult to see any other source of demand which is quite as high as China coming in the near future. And so if China, for whatever reason, starts to drop in consumption, I think we will face a very, very large problem in the steel industry.
In consumption of steel, you mean, not
Yes,
consumption of... Yeah.
Consumption
Yes.
of steel.
Which means what you guys need is you need the investment regime to continue. The regime where China doesn't consume but invests, it's good for you.
For the time being.
Yes. But yeah, until something really crashes, which is usually always the case. Yeah.
Let's ask Mr. Li Shenchang in the following session. Any other questions? I guess not. All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Patikis.
Thank you.